A 4-year-old boy disappeared from a logging camp in the Montana mountains in 1974 while his father worked a Saturday shift. 52 years later, a dying woman in a hospice bed 3 states away would finally say the name nobody had been able to get out of her for half a century, and send investigators to a small Oregon town where the missing boy was living an ordinary adult life under a name that was never his. The Bitterroot Valley in July has a particular kind of green to it, deep and short-lived, the kind that knows it's only got a few weeks before the heat turns everything gold. It was that green the summer Henry Prescott vanished, and nobody in the camp where his family lived thought there was any reason to be afraid of it. It was 1974, a Saturday in mid-July, at a logging camp tucked into the hills outside a small Montana mill town. The camp housed a dozen families whose fathers worked the timber operation that fed the mill down in the valley. A tight cluster of company houses and shared yards where kids ran between porches all summer, with a freedom that would look reckless to later generations, but felt, at the time, like simply how childhood worked. Henry was 4 years old, the youngest of 4 children, a round-faced boy who followed his older brothers everywhere they'd let him and cried when they wouldn't. His mother, Dorothy, ran the camp's small communal garden along with 2 other wives. His father, Walt, worked Saturday shifts that summer to make up for a slow spring, gone from 6 in the morning until the whistle blew at 4. The camp itself operated on a kind of collective parenting that was common to company towns in that era. Whichever mother happened to be nearest kept an eye on whichever children happened to be nearby, and everyone understood the arrangement without ever needing to discuss it. Doors between houses stood open all summer. The camp cook kept a jar of hard candy on her porch rail specifically for kids passing by. A single party-line telephone served the whole camp, meaning news traveled by shouted word between porches faster than it ever could have by wire. Saturday nights brought a communal supper on whichever family's porch had the most shade, and the men who worked 6 days a week treated Sunday as sacred, spent almost entirely on rest and small repairs. Henry's disappearance would end that particular kind of unguarded community trust for good, though nobody in July of 1974 could have imagined that yet. Henry himself was a quiet, watchful boy who'd inherited his mother's stubbornness and his father's habit of humming under his breath. Without noticing, he was doing it. He'd just learned to whistle that spring and practiced constantly, badly, to the great amusement of the whole camp. Dorothy used to say he had an old soul in a small body, content to sit on the porch steps and watch the older children's games rather than insist on joining every one of them, though he'd chase after his brothers eagerly enough whenever they let him. Henry had been playing in the yard between 2 company houses with 3 other camp children that afternoon, under the loose supervision of a mother 2 houses down who was canning tomatoes and checking on the group every few minutes between batches. At some point in a stretch of maybe 20 minutes, the other children wandered toward the creek that ran along the camp's edge, and when the supervising mother did her next check, Henry wasn't with them. At first, nobody panicked. Camp kids wandered in and out of each other's yards constantly, and a 4-year-old turning up at a neighbor's porch eating someone else's lunch was hardly unusual. Dorothy was told within the hour and began checking houses herself, calling Henry's name down the row of company homes, growing more frantic with each empty porch. By the time Walt was pulled off his shift and driven back up to the camp, 3 hours had passed, and the entire camp, every off-duty logger, every wife, every child old enough to walk, was searching the surrounding hillside and creek bottom. They searched through the night with lanterns and torches, and through the next day with dogs brought up from the county seat, and through the following week with search parties that eventually numbered in the hundreds, drawn from 3 counties once word reached the valley below. They found nothing. No clothing snagged on brush, no footprint beyond the ordinary comings and goings of camp life. No sign at all that a 4-year-old boy had gone anywhere but simply out of existence, somewhere between one porch and the next. Sheriff's Deputy Roy Nakamura was 26 years old when he caught the case, one of the few investigators the county had who could be spared to live at the camp itself for the first 2 weeks of the search. He was young, new to the job, and would carry this case in one form or another for the rest of his career. He interviewed every family in the camp, some of them 3 and 4 times. He walked the creek bottom personally for miles in both directions. He requested state assistance almost immediately and got 2 investigators for the better part of a month, an unusually generous allocation for the era that reflected how quickly the case had drawn regional attention. The working theory in those early weeks leaned toward the creek itself, which ran high and fast that July after a wet spring, cutting through terrain rugged enough to hide a small body for a long time, possibly permanently. But Nakamura never fully believed it, in part because of something one of the other children, a 6-year-old girl, said in her second interview, that a man she didn't recognize had been standing near the tree line at the edge of camp that afternoon, watching the yard where the kids were playing. She couldn't describe him beyond tall and wearing a green jacket, details a 6-year-old's memory could easily have invented or distorted, but Nakamura wrote them down and never fully let them go. Dorothy shared Nakamura's instinct completely and rejected the drowning theory from the first day, certain that Henry, cautious by nature and wary of the creek's current even in play, wouldn't have gone near the water alone. The state investigators assigned to assist leaned more heavily on the physical possibility of an accidental drowning, if only because it required no unidentified suspect and no unexplained vehicle. A gap between instinct and procedure that mirrored what other families in other decades would come to know as the particular loneliness of watching officials work a case by the evidence available, rather than a mother's certainty. Nakamura split the difference in his own private notes, pursuing the creek exhaustively while never closing the file on the man in the green jacket. The camp itself changed permanently that summer. The company reassigned 2 logging crews to camps further from town within a year, quietly thinning the population of the place where it happened. Families who'd lived there for a decade began locking doors that had never been locked before. The unsupervised freedom that had defined childhood at the camp ended entirely, replaced by a wariness that lingered even after most of the original families had scattered to other towns. The case went cold within 3 years, though Nakamura never let it fully close, requesting updates from the state crime lab periodically as forensic techniques slowly improved through the 70s and 80s, hoping each advance might finally give him something to work with from a scene that had produced almost no physical evidence in the first place. The Prescott family absorbed the loss the way families in isolated company towns often did, with the whole community grieving alongside them, and with no real escape from a place that would forever be the site of what happened. Walt requested a transfer to a mill job in the valley within 2 years, unable to keep working timber crews that passed daily within sight of the creek, where his son might still be. Dorothy kept a photograph of Henry on the kitchen windowsill of every house the family lived in for the next 50 years, moving it each time like a small ritual of continuity, and never once let anyone in the family throw away Henry's small collection of toy trucks, which traveled with the family through 4 different houses over 5 decades. Henry's 3 older siblings grew up under a particular kind of watchfulness their parents never fully released, one that shaped all 3 of their own approaches to raising children decades later. Each of them, by their own later admission, more anxious about unsupervised play than their neighbors ever seemed to understand. By 1979, 5 years gone, the family held a small memorial service, not a funeral, since nobody in the family would agree to have Henry declared legally dead, but a public acknowledgement the community seemed to need almost as much as the Prescotts did. By 1984, 10 years, a wildfire swept through the hills above the old camp, burning terrain that had once been searched inch by inch. A fire Dorothy has said she experienced almost as a second loss, watching the last physical trace of that July disappear under smoke. By 1989, 15 years, the original logging camp was fully decommissioned, its buildings eventually torn down, leaving only a stand of trees and a stretch of creek that locals still, decades later, referred to quietly as where the Prescott boy went missing. By 1999, 25 years, Nakamura, promoted by then to detective, gave his first extended interview to a regional newspaper marking the anniversary, still naming the man in the green jacket as the lead he'd never been able to close. By 2004, 30 years, the case was formally reclassified in county records as an active cold case, rather than a presumed accidental death. A distinction that meant everything to Dorothy and almost nothing to the physical search itself. By 2009, 35 years, Dorothy Prescott, in her 70s, began attending a support group for parents of long-term missing children, traveling 4 hours each way to the nearest chapter for the rest of her life. By 2019, 45 years, Walt passed away, having spent the last 2 decades of his life quietly certain his son was dead and equally quietly unable to say so out loud in front of his wife. If you've ever lived somewhere that carries a story like this in its collective memory, decades after the people involved have mostly moved away, you understand something about how grief settles permanently into a place. Tell us in the comments if your own hometown carries a story like this one. We read every one. By 2026, Dorothy Prescott was 89 years old, living in an assisted care facility in the valley, one of the last people alive who remembered the camp as it had existed before that July. That spring, a hospice chaplain in Idaho, 3 states away, was called to the bedside of a dying woman named Ruth Whitlock, a former transient who had drifted through logging and mining camps across 4 states for most of her adult life, before finally settling into an assisted living facility a decade earlier with a man she'd called her husband, though no marriage record for the 2 of them has ever been found. Ruth, aware she was dying and reportedly wrestling with something she wanted to unburden before the end, began telling the chaplain fragments of a story about a camp in Montana in the summer of 1974. About a boy she said her partner, Gerald, had brought back to their trailer one afternoon on an impulse neither of them, in her telling, had ever fully explained to themselves since, and about the boy they had raised from that day forward as their own son, under a name that was never his. The chaplain, bound by professional obligation but deeply troubled, encouraged Ruth to speak with law enforcement directly, and she gave a recorded statement to Idaho detectives who contacted their Montana counterparts within hours. She described a man in his early 50s, living under the name Daniel Whitlock, whom she and Gerald had raised as their son from age 4 onward, moving frequently across state lines throughout his childhood in a pattern she now recognized, decades later, as designed to keep questions from ever catching up to them. Gerald had died 6 years earlier. Ruth herself had days left. Montana investigators, working now with Nakamura himself, 84 years old, retired more than 2 decades, but immediately willing to reopen a case he'd carried his entire career, located Daniel Whitlock within 11 days of Ruth's statement, living in a small town in eastern Oregon, working as a heavy equipment operator, married, with 2 adult children of his own. When investigators approached him, he was confused by the inquiry in a way that read, to the detectives present, as entirely genuine. He had always understood himself to be the biological son of Gerald and Ruth Whitlock, with no memory at all of any life before roughly age 4. Which he had always assumed was simply the ordinary boundary of early childhood memory. DNA testing, arranged carefully and with Dorothy's full knowledge before any public confirmation, resolved the question within 3 weeks. Daniel Whitlock was Henry Prescott. He was alive. The news moved through the valley the way news does in a place that has carried a single unanswered question for 52 years. Not as simple joy, though there was joy in it, but as a kind of exhausted, disorienting relief that arrived tangled together with 52 years of grief the family had never gotten the chance to properly set down. Longtime residents who'd grown up hearing about the Prescott boy as a cautionary tale about the creek, about strangers, about a kind of unguarded freedom their own children would never be allowed, found themselves confronting the fact that the boy in that story was alive, had been alive the entire time, living an ordinary life a few states away under a name that was never his. Investigators have said the case will remain formally open despite Gerald Whitlock's death, in hopes of determining the full circumstances of that July afternoon in 1974, including whether the couple's movements across a dozen towns and 4 states over 5 decades were as deliberately evasive as Ruth's final statement suggested. Records of their movements through various logging and mining camps are being reconstructed as far as surviving employment archives allow, and prosecutors have said they intend to pursue whatever charges the evidence and Ruth's limited remaining time will support before she too is gone. Dorothy Prescott was told her son was alive by Detective Nakamura himself, in person, in the same assisted living facility where she'd spent her final years. She has said, in the only public statement her family has released, that 52 years of not knowing had taught her to expect she would die without an answer. And that being handed this one instead, her son, alive, a grown man with children of his own, was a kind of joy she had stopped allowing herself to imagine decades ago. Henry met his mother for the first time in over half a century that same month, in a quiet room at the assisted living facility, his 3 surviving siblings present alongside her. He did not remember any of them, could not have remembered a childhood that ended, for him, entirely before age 4. The reunion, by every account, was careful and overwhelming in equal measure. A woman meeting the son she'd spent 52 years grieving, and a man meeting an entire family history he'd never known existed, both of them working, slowly and gently, toward a relationship neither had any script for. Henry, he has said he intends to keep the name Daniel professionally and with his own children, while learning to hold his birth name alongside it, has said publicly that he doesn't experience this as losing a life he never chose, but as gaining a mother, siblings, and a history he never knew he was missing. A reframing his own wife and children are still working to understand as they meet grandparents and an extended family tree that appeared overnight, out of nowhere. Roy Nakamura, 84 years old, said finding Henry alive was the first piece of unqualified relief he'd allowed himself to feel about this case in 52 years. He said the detail a 6-year-old girl gave him in 1974, a tall man in a green jacket at the edge of camp, had turned out, after everything, to be exactly right. 52 years too late to have changed anything about how those years unfolded, but not too late to finally close the file with an answer instead of a guess. What does it mean to spend 52 years as someone else's son, raised across a dozen towns under a name that was never yours, only to be found through a dying woman's final confession? What do we owe a mother who waited half a century for an answer that came only days before the woman who could give it ran out of time herself? And how many more Henrys are out there right now, living ordinary lives under names that were never truly theirs, waiting on someone's deathbed to finally say what they've carried in silence for decades? Henry Prescott is home. Not the 4-year-old his mother lost on that hillside. That boy is gone, reshaped by 5 decades neither he nor his family will ever get back. But a son, finally found alive, and a truth that arrived just in time for his mother to hear it. If this case moved you, subscribe for more cold cases finally solved, and tell us below which detail stayed with you longest. This is a work of fiction. Henry Prescott, Gerald and Ruth Whitlock, Roy Nakamura, and all named individuals and locations are invented and do not depict any real person, case, or event.